The Foreword to The American Home Front, 1941 to 1942, by Alistair Cooke. Introduction by Harold Evans. New York, November 2005. Wartime Britain, though few nowadays have a personal memory of those years, is fairly well etched into our collective imaginations. The silent, blacked-out streets, the night skies lit by beams searching for bombers, the raucously cheerful workers' playtime lunch hour concerts broadcast from a factory somewhere in the north, the boxed gas masks on every scurrying shoulder, the nightly pip-pip-pip preceding BBC radio bulletins, where the only consolation for the invariably bad news was that the unshaky baritone of the announcer, Alvar Liddell, suggested that somehow there would always be an England. There was a palpable sense of isolation, and then there was the marvelous moment when Mr. Liddell at last had something good to relate. America had entered the war. Nobody in Britain had much more than the foggiest notion then what the Americans might bring to the war, or indeed what Americans were really like. There was just a palimpsest of Franklin Roosevelt, Charlie Chaplin, John Steinbeck's Okies. Saul Steinberg's famous New Yorker cartoon was drawn years later, but summed up the perspective then and now. The skyscrapers of Manhattan distended westwards to Hollywood and the Pacific, with something vague and dusty in between. The arrival in ration book Britain of GIs armed with the temptations of nylon stockings and cartons of cigarettes excited more envy than curiosity. After all, they came in late last time, took the credit for whipping the Kaiser, didn't they? And they were coming in late again. What was happening in the vast mystery of America was, of course, of supreme importance and more than passing interest, as that new American citizen Alistair Cooke realized at the time. Having worked in London as the BBC's film critic, he had returned to America in 1937 in time to hear the drum rolls of war reaching Washington from the Far East. He was in the capital for Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and then on the morning of February 27, 1942, he left the air of tobacco-choked energy that is the Washington odor of panic. Forsaking the hot news from the capital, he set out on a prodigious journey to explore the country, south, west, north, and east. On the first trip, he drove much of the way in a car with 5 retreads. Then in 1943 and 1944, he did the trip again by train and bus. Only a handful of Americans have seen the country like that, still less reflected on its diversities. There is nothing weird about the doctor he meets in St. Louis, who tells him, "I was never west of Louisville, nor east of Charleston, West Virginia." The reporter is long past deadline with his report, you may think. He did finish it in 1945, but everyone then wanted to forget and forge ahead with a brave new world. So he put his manuscript aside. A couple of weeks before he died, his secretary, Patty Yasek, was cleaning out a closet crammed with papers, and way at the back she came across 2 copies of a few hundred typed sheets headed "The Face of a Nation." Cooke was thrilled at its rediscovery, and so will be his readers. 60 years have enhanced its intrinsic interest, since it is at once a kaleidoscopic portrait of an America now vanished, and a sketch of a fighting mad nation spitting on its hands. Very little has been written about that home front in comparison to the mountains of battlefront literature. Cooke was 33 when he began his journey, and while the manuscript lay unpublished for so many years, what he learned clearly nourished the broadcasts about America he began in 1940, which became Letter from America in 1946, and continued until 2004. In this book, so magically spirited from the past and into your hands, he is mostly concerned with a characterful people scattered on a panoramic landscape emerging from one nightmare, the Great Depression, to enter another. He observes that a farm the size of Surrey is being transformed into a tank training ground, and that a lovely 5-mile peach orchard in Georgia has been torn up for warplanes parked wingtip to wingtip like a plague of locusts. But he forbears to take us on exhausting excursions into factories. For that we can be grateful, but some perspective is necessary to appreciate what came out of all the encounters he records so well. We know now, and we have the word of Joe Stalin for it, that for all the sacrifices of our fighting men and women and the slog in our factories, the Allies would not have won the war in the West and the other war in the East without the way the American people, with amazing speed, created an arsenal no coalition of nations could come close to matching. Britain trebled its war output between 1940 and 1943, a ratio surpassing both Germany and Russia, who doubled theirs, though Japan excelled with a fourfold increase. And America. America stepped up its war output by a staggering 25 times. For instance, in 1941, a Liberty cargo ship of British design required 200 days to launch. Henry Kaiser, the dam builder from Spokane, had never before built a ship or airplane or handled steel, but he experimented with prefabrication and cut the time to 40 days. For his next trick, he finished the John Fitch 24 hours after laying the keel. Without the fleets of Kaiser's ships carrying supplies, Britain would no doubt have starved. Cooke once wrote that only by the wildest freak is a reporter actually present at a single accidental convulsion of history. This volume is not that. It is more of a pointillist painting than the flashbulb of a news report, but, as it happens, he was present at the convulsive opening moment of Japanese betrayal, and his writing throughout is informed by the qualities that drew so many millions to his current reporting. When he broadcast his account of the murder of Bobby Kennedy in 1968, for instance, we had read the news reports, heard the screams, had seen the fuzzy television pictures of Ethel Kennedy cradling her dying husband. But it was one of Cooke's most memorable letters from America, for the same reasons that this volume emerges so vividly from the dust of 60 years. The detail was vivid but the language calm, as of someone struggling to keep hold of his sanity at the utter squalid futility of what he was seeing, the face of the bloodied Bobby Kennedy staring up from the kitchen floor, quote, like the stone face of a child's effigy on a cathedral tomb, end quote. Cooke's report moved us from contemplation of an external event to immersion in it. Because he is such a good observer, such a cool but evocative writer, and so schooled in the history of America and its personalities, he sees more than the camera or the casual onlooker, more even than those involved. On November 15, 1941, there landed at LaGuardia Airport a small, stocky man with spiky black hair, thick spectacles, and an excitable voice. This was Saburo Kurusu, a Japanese diplomat and admirer of America, who had married a girl from Chicago with the unthreatening name of Alice Little. Now he was arriving to negotiate with America, unknowingly in bad faith, unaware of the Pearl Harbor plot in which his masters had decided to act like a cunning dragon seemingly asleep. Kurusu had hardly unpacked in his Washington hotel before the Japanese battle fleet was ordered to sail for Hawaii, but Cooke records with characteristic honesty that he felt a touch ashamed at the rough questioning the press hounds gave the exhausted special envoy. Spiky hair was so ragged from 13 hours in the air he did not know whether he was standing or sitting. Quote, he would say one sentence up and the next one down. End quote. Cooke's deep affection for America and knowledge of its craggy cast of characters informs the sequel, when Kurusu and the Japanese ambassador arrive late to deliver their terms to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the silver-haired Tennessean, who knows what they do not, that the attack has begun. Hull's formal denunciation of Japan's infamous falsehoods and distortions is on record. What Cooke adds, with a polite nod to the stenographer, is a surmise of what he really hissed. Abusive idiom, deriving half from animal biology, half from the Bible, of which the Tennessee mountaineers need never be ashamed. Those who have seen and heard Mr. Hull in indignation would hardly settle for a sentence from Gibbon. When Roosevelt arrived in Congress to indict the Japanese for their day of infamy, the world saw the lion-headed man standing strongly at the lectern. Thanks to a rare sense of delicacy in the press and a patriotic scruple, the world did not see what Cooke records here. A weary, paralyzed man enters the House of Representatives with infinite slowness, limping from side to side, holding the arm of his uniformed son. A gathering of people expecting to see the President of the United States, quote, see the Archangel Gabriel walk in instead. It is no less than the unexpected and dramatic revelation, very rarely made in public, of what a man can suffer and what he can grow to by reason of it. As late as the summer of 1940, you could drive across the American continent and never see a soldier. America's standing army was about the size of Sweden's. When the young reporter left Washington a few weeks after FDR's speech, the American Leviathan was already beginning to stir, and not just with the manufacture of lethal instruments. Those dried eggs and powdered milk that the British fell on with grumbling appreciation came from Wisconsin's dairy farmers, so modern they had machines that recorded a cow's history and her horoscope. Before the war, there were no egg-drying plants. In a jiffy they had built a score. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, they had shipped 100 million cases of powdered milk, 600,000 of them to Britain. It is nice to read the dairy farmers lament. Quote, the British take only the top grade of our dairy products, and the lesser grades are left on our hands. End quote. In West Virginia, Cooke sees women at work as hardwood carpenters, to the resentment of those few older men who have not been sucked into aviation and chemicals. He drives through the snow to the Greenbrier Mountain Resort Hotel to find it filled with 600 long-stay guests, German, Italian, and Hungarian diplomats interned for the duration. The adjacent town is spooked by rumors of plots, murders, and stabbings up there in the dark at the Greenbrier. In another town, 300 miles from the East Coast, 2,700 citizens have paid to learn how to look out for dive bombers, in case Goering should ever find how to get them across the Atlantic in the first place. There are early warnings of more substantial threats to the American way of life. A small town soda fountain carries the news. Regret, out of Coca-Cola. In Louisville, he is reminded that, in the interest of national defense, his morning coffee must be infused with no more than 1 spoon of sugar. The city swarms with men in uniform rehearsing maneuvers for encircling the rouged and giggling teenage girls who have flooded in from the farmlands. In a cafe, some soldiers from the north and west tease a Southern recruit about his distrust of Negroes. Cooke is acutely aware that his patchwork experiences do not entitle him to make gravely definitive pronouncements on the state of race relations, or on wartime morale, profiteering, the emerging emancipation of women, the effects of mass migration, and the like. One of his agreeable traits as a reporter is candor. In the Kennedy shooting, he wrote, quote, everybody wanted to make space and air, but everybody also wanted to see the worst. End quote. In this book, he discusses the dilemmas of the reporter, foreign correspondent, who is expected to suggest omniscience on the basis of a conversation with a taxi driver from the train station and the barkeep at the hotel. Quote, We are a tribe of artful men who have learned over the years to stifle our doubts about our own capacity to observe." End quote. So this writer of a foreword has to acknowledge that it is purely on the basis of random impressions, of Alistair's random impressions, that one notes his notes of pustules of anti-Semitism. "Gentile clientele," says an engraved sign at a counter in a Miami Beach hotel. There can be no doubt, though, about the prevalence of prejudice against blacks. In Kansas City, the domestic helpers rushed into the small arms factories, their places in middle-class families taken by Negroes from the South. They would contrast the comfort of their new homes with the unyielding Jim Crow line down at the railroad station. There were showers for the white soldiers, none for their boys. The reporter records one terse comment: "We're all right to shoot at, but not so good to keep clean." Roaring Detroit, making jeeps, tanks, guns, and bombers, was the scene of the worst hate riots in 1943, when the city tried to find somewhere to house the Negro labor from the South. One stubs one's toe painfully from time to time on this long journey, but it remains exhilarating, sometimes inspiring. There are the Greek sponge divers of Tarpon Springs, Florida, who dive 40 fathoms with a heavy stone, daily risking death from suffocation and sharks to fill an urgent war contract. Few minorities in the country are so unprotestingly patriotic. There's the redoubtable Mr. Higgins in New Orleans, a big and profane lumberman, disdained by the upper crust, who makes a point of hiring Negroes. He designed the first models of the PTs, patrol torpedo boats, snapped up by bootleggers of Prohibition days, trying to escape the Coast Guard. Now, under government contract, he's making the torpedo boats that will give the Japanese such trouble, tank lighters, and landing barges. He turns out 8 ships of one kind or another every 10 days. A striking feature of the reporter's journey across America and into its past is the anecdotal evidence of what men can achieve with security. A big cattle rancher in Wyoming tells him, "Don't you forget it, son. Folks around here are more dubious about Washington than the outcome of the war." But throughout the journey, and especially in the wheatlands of the Western Plains and the cotton country of the Deep South, it is clear that the framework of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal gave America a running start. When the topsoil blew away in the early 30s, and the Okies fled the darkened Dust Bowl in their jalopies for California, Roosevelt's Department of Agriculture nurtured a faith that grass could be made to grow again. Cooke reports that by 1941, the abandoned barren lands had grown enough grass for a whole new cattle industry. The Dust Bowl had become the Beef Bowl, a fact all too little known by the other industry of denouncing that man in Washington. In the Deep South, the Farm Security Administration kept alive at least a tenth of the nation's poorest farmers, and that paid dividends in the war. Cooke reports a conversation between a poor Negro sharecropper who thinks his land fit for nothing and a Mr. McDowell, an FSA advisor. McDowell offers the sharecropper a loan if he will help to win the war by growing peanuts. The result is vintage Cooke. Quote, "Peanuts," he howls, "the government must sure enough be in terrible shape." "Yes, we want peanuts for the fats and oils, and we need eggs, millions of them, to dry for the army and to send overseas. Can you raise some hens here, do you think?" The Negro looks aghast. "Mr. McDowell, if the government want to pay me for raising elephants, I'll sure make a powerful try." End quote. It is noticeable how much the war gets closer as the reporter moves west. He finds a subdued air when he arrives in Deming, New Mexico, 10 days after the fall of Bataan and the surrender of all the Americans in the Philippines. The blinds are drawn, shops are closed. 150 men from a town of only 2,000 were in an anti-tank unit of the New Mexico State Guard, rushed into the battle zone as the Japanese smashed their way south. What can he say to the widows and mothers who come to see him? How shall he respond to their suspicions that there was something wrong with so many boys from one town dying 6,000 miles away for a place that some senator, they read, had said should never have been defended anyway? By the time he arrives in the booming part of San Diego, the pace is as frantic as the Klondike. He drops in on one of the busiest operators, a tattooist. The man testifies. What does one make of it? That in World War I, men came in and asked for a heart and their girlfriend's name. But this time they seem to want just the word mother. The backwater of Los Angeles throbs, proud of its transformation into a war factory. Endless swarms of automobiles, wriggling into the darkness, going into the night shift at Lockheed or Vultee. And going home, the reporter notes, to shacks, trailers, and drab single rooms alien to the dream factory up the road. Hollywood has its own problems. It is eager to make war movies to boost home front morale, but it's tricky in a strategic region, very jumpy about infiltration. It was all right to have Spanish loyalists and foreign legionnaires fighting it out in the hills, but imaginary Japanese attacking a dummy airport near San Francisco would panic the state. So the Army tells the movie makers they have to stage their combats miles away in Utah. It's their responsibility to alert good Mormons that the fleet of Japanese bombers they will see being destroyed by American fighters won't mean the war is over. We can be grateful today that the young reporter was enterprising and concerned enough to drive from Hollywood into the high Sierras. He wanted to assess a dark side of America at war. In March 1942, 70,000 American citizens in the West were cruelly removed from their homes and businesses and shipped into 10 desolate camps in the high Sierras because they had Japanese mothers and fathers. The day after Pearl Harbor, the FBI had swiftly arrested 2,000 male Japanese bad risks. This was a justified and entirely different process. The 2,000 were entitled to review. The 70,000 citizens were not. When they arrived at the camps in Army trucks, bereft of their possessions, they were dumped behind barbed wire and guards and had to make do in windowless, heatless, tar-papered shacks. Cooke is moved by the experience of visiting the Japanese Americans in a camp at Manzanar. They have put the ramshackle place in order and run it themselves with elections, a newspaper of their own, and free speech. Somehow they have also kept their faith in America. Driving away in a somber mood, he is none too proud of what his proudly adopted country has done. How slippery seemed the solid abstractions we preach when you journey 6,000 miles and find democracy in a concentration camp. Alistair Cooke, 60 years on, retains his relevance. This is a time to reflect on the bad things that may be done in the name of a good cause. That ends Harold Evans' Foreword to the American Home Front, 1941 to 1942, by Alistair Cooke. Thank you for listening.